Sir William Ashworth, 75-year-old millionaire, had completely lost faith in humanity. When he hired Charlotte, a 25-year-old housekeeper, he decided to test her in the most cruel way possible. He left his armored safe open with £5 million inside, pretending to have left the house. What he saw through the security cameras shocked him so much that it changed his view of people forever. Charlotte didn't do what William expected. She did something completely unexpected that made him cry and revealed a secret that neither of them imagined. Ashworth Manor stood majestically in the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, near Oxford. Sir William Ashworth, at 75, was one of the richest men in England, but all his fortune couldn't buy him the one thing he truly desired: genuine people around him. Over the past 10 years, William had discovered that anyone who approached him had only one interest: his money. His nephew had tried to have him declared mentally incapacitated to seize the inheritance. His niece had stolen £100,000 from his personal account. Even his trusted doctor had been inflating bills for years. The final straw came when he discovered that his 20-year housekeeper was selling his art objects on eBay. This woman, who called him Grandpa William, had turned his home into a black market for antiques. Since then, William had lived alone in the 400-square-meter manor, surrounded only by security cameras and bitterness. But at 75, he needed help managing the household. That's when Charlotte Bennet arrived. 25 years old, from a small village in Yorkshire, she had come to London with a cardboard suitcase and a dream: to earn a degree in art history at University College London. She worked as a housekeeper to finance her studies and still sent money to her parents, who struggled to keep their small corner shop running. During the interview, Charlotte didn't ask about salary or benefits. She wanted to know if she could clean the library without moving the books, and whether William had any food allergies. William hired her, but he already had a plan in mind. The next morning, William executed his final test. He deliberately opened the armored safe in his study, leaving £5 million in notes clearly visible. He announced that he was going out for an appointment that would last all afternoon. He hid in his secret room upstairs, from where he could monitor all the manor's cameras. He had conducted the same test with all employees over recent years. Some lasted an hour, others a day, but all eventually succumbed to temptation. William settled comfortably in front of the monitors, ready to watch Charlotte take the money. He already had the dismissal speech and police report prepared. Another disappointment to add to his collection, another proof that love of money corrupted every soul. But what he saw on the monitors left him completely baffled. William observed the monitors with the skepticism of someone who had seen the same story too many times. Charlotte methodically cleaned the library, treating each book with a delicacy that surprised him. She didn't just dust, but checked the covers and repositioned volumes that were slightly out of place. After an hour, Charlotte headed to the study. William leaned forward, his heart beginning to beat faster. Here was the moment of truth. Charlotte entered and began cleaning the desk. The open safe was perfectly visible from her position, the notes seeming to glimmer under the lamp's light. But Charlotte didn't even glance in that direction. She continued cleaning the desk, organized the pens in their holder, and arranged documents in a neat pile. William waited for her eyes to fall on the money, for temptation to take over. Instead, Charlotte turned around and began dusting the study's bookshelves. Half an hour passed, then an hour. Charlotte worked with an almost meditative concentration, as if cleaning this house were the most important thing in the world. At one point, she came dangerously close to the safe to dust the painting that concealed it. William held his breath. Charlotte noticed the safe was open. William saw the exact moment she realized what she was seeing. But instead of approaching or looking closer, Charlotte did something completely unexpected. She immediately moved away from the safe, as if it were too hot to approach. She looked around nervously, then picked up the phone and called William's office. When the secretary answered, Charlotte explained worriedly that Sir Ashworth had left the safe open and perhaps forgotten to close it before leaving. The secretary told her not to touch anything and wait for his return. Charlotte remained thoughtful for a few minutes, then made a decision that left William speechless. She fetched a chair, positioned it in front of the safe, and sat down. Not to look at the money or take it, but to stand guard. William couldn't believe what he was seeing. Charlotte had decided to protect his money. She sat there, back to the safe, keeping watch like a soldier. Occasionally she got up to continue cleaning other parts of the house, but always returned to check everything was in order. At lunchtime, Charlotte prepared a sandwich in the kitchen, but instead of eating it comfortably at the table, she returned to the study and lunched sitting on the chair in front of the safe. William was increasingly puzzled. What kind of person was Charlotte Bennett? At 5 o'clock, the Manor's doorbell rang. It was a delivery driver with a parcel. Normally, Charlotte would have answered, but she explained through the intercom that the master of the house wasn't in, and he should return tomorrow. William realized that Charlotte was afraid to leave the safe unattended, even for the few minutes needed to receive a delivery. She was protecting his money, as if it were her own children. Half an hour later, Charlotte received a phone call that made her cry. William could only hear her side of the conversation, but understood there were serious problems at home. Charlotte's parents were about to lose their shop because they couldn't pay a £30,000 debt to the bank. Charlotte wept while talking on the phone, explaining she didn't have that money and her salary would never be enough. William saw her look around desperately, and for a moment, her eyes rested on the open safe. This is the moment, William thought. Now Charlotte would do what all the others had done. Even with the best intentions, desperation would drive her to take that money. But Charlotte did something William didn't expect. She got up from the chair, approached the safe, and closed it determinedly. She turned the combination to ensure it was properly sealed, then returned to her chair and continued crying silently. William realized that Charlotte had just given up the chance to save her family rather than betray his trust, and he didn't even know who this extraordinary girl really was. William remained seated in front of the monitors, completely shaken by what he had just witnessed. In 75 years of life, he had met thousands of people, but never had he seen anyone behave like Charlotte. The girl had just given up the chance to save her family, rather than violate his trust. Charlotte was still sitting in front of the closed safe, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the phone. William understood she was thinking about how to tell her parents she couldn't help them. That image struck him straight to the heart. For the first time in years, William felt something he thought he had lost forever. Genuine emotion. He left his hiding place and headed to the main entrance, making noise as if he were really returning home. Charlotte ran to meet him, eyes still red but trying to hide her distress. She immediately apologized about the safe, explaining she had found it open and been afraid to leave it unprotected. William asked if everything was all right, if anything had happened during his absence. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, then smiled forcedly, and said everything was perfect. William insisted, noticing she seemed troubled, and finally Charlotte broke down. Through tears, she told him about her parents' call. Their small corner shop had been in crisis for months. The arrival of a supermarket in their village had halved their customers. Now the bank wanted to close the shop because they couldn't pay a £30,000 debt. Charlotte explained she had come to London precisely for this reason, to earn enough money to help her family. But, with her housekeeper's salary and university expenses, she could only send £300 a month home. It would never be enough to save the shop. William listened in silence, his heart tightening more and more. This girl worked 18 hours a day between university and domestic work, lived in a shared room with 3 other students, survived on sandwiches and plain pasta, all to help her family and achieve her dream of graduating. Charlotte apologized for crying in front of him, saying she didn't want to involve him in her personal problems. She would find a way to help her parents, perhaps a second job. William remained silent for a few minutes, thinking. Then he told her he needed to check something in his study and asked her to accompany him. In the study, William approached the safe and began turning the combination. Charlotte immediately moved away, explaining she didn't want to see the combination to avoid tempting herself or others. But William stopped her. He explained that that morning he had left the safe open on purpose. It was a test he conducted on all his employees to discover who they really were. All, without exception, had failed the test. Charlotte looked at him shocked. William explained that after years of betrayals, he had lost faith in humanity. But what Charlotte had done that day had taught him something precious. There were still honest people in the world. He opened the safe and withdrew an envelope. Inside were £50,000 in cash. He handed it to her, saying she had earned it, not only for passing the test, but for restoring his faith in humanity. Charlotte looked at the envelope without taking it, tears flowing down her face again. She said she couldn't accept that money, that she hadn't done anything special. She had only done what was right. William smiled for the first time in months. He explained that precisely that was special, doing what's right when no one is watching and when there's no reward. But what William was about to discover about Charlotte would completely change his life and the meaning of this test. Charlotte looked at the envelope with tear-filled eyes, but still didn't take it. William was confused. He had just offered the girl more than her parents earned in 2 years. Why was she still hesitating? Charlotte wiped her tears and looked William straight in the eyes. What she said shook him deeply. She couldn't accept that money because it didn't belong to her in any way. She had only done her duty, and duty isn't paid for. But there was something else she had to tell him. With a trembling voice, Charlotte began telling a story William didn't expect. 2 years earlier, when she had just arrived in London, she had worked as a waitress in a restaurant in the city centre. One evening, while cleaning tables, she had found a handbag left behind by a customer. Inside were documents, credit cards, and £2,000 in cash.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Charlotte had handed everything to the restaurant owner to return to the customer. But the next day, she discovered the man had kept the money for himself, telling the customer the bag contained only documents. That night, Charlotte had cried for hours, not for the money she could have kept, but because she realized how cruel the world could be to honest people. She had promised herself never to let others' greed change her. William listened, fascinated. He began to understand that Charlotte wasn't just naturally honest, but had made a conscious choice to remain so despite disappointments. Charlotte continued explaining that when she saw the open safe that morning, she had immediately understood it was a test. Not because she was particularly clever, but because she had already heard stories of wealthy people testing their employees in similar ways. William was speechless. Charlotte had known from the beginning it was a test and still acted honestly? But Charlotte wasn't finished. With increasingly emotional voice, she revealed she knew William much more than he imagined. It hadn't been coincidence that the agency proposed her for this job. Charlotte had specifically requested to work for him. William was puzzled. Why would Charlotte have wanted to work precisely for him? Charlotte went to her bag and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. It was an article from 3 years ago about William's donations to a children's hospital in Manchester. The article explained that William had paid out of his own pocket for medical treatments for 15 sick children, but had requested his identity remain secret. Charlotte explained that one of those children was her cousin, James. The boy had a heart malformation requiring very expensive surgery. The family didn't have money for the operation, and health insurance didn't cover this type of experimental surgery. One day, without explanation, the hospital called saying an anonymous benefactor had paid all medical expenses for James. The operation was a perfect success, and now James was a healthy and happy child. Charlotte had discovered the benefactor's identity only by chance, when a nurse accidentally dropped a document with William's name. Since then, she had researched him and discovered he had been making anonymous donations for years. Hospitals, schools, orphanages, needy families. That's why Charlotte had wanted to work for him, not for money or opportunity, but because she wanted to meet the man who had saved her cousin's life. She wanted to understand what kind of person did good without asking for anything in return. William was shaken. For years he had thought himself surrounded only by people interested in his money. And here before him was a girl who had sought him out because she admired his generosity. Charlotte concluded by explaining that's why she couldn't accept his money. William had already done so much for her family by saving James. It wouldn't be fair to accept more. William remained silent for long minutes, processing everything he had heard. Then he did something that surprised them both. He began to cry. These were tears of relief, joy, emotion. For the first time in years, he felt truly understood and valued for what he was, not what he possessed. But William also had a secret to reveal, something that would forever change Charlotte's life. William wiped his tears and looked at Charlotte with an expression she had never seen before. There was tenderness, gratitude, but also something else that seemed like an important decision. He asked her to sit because he had something very important to tell her. William began explaining that the safe test wasn't just a way to unmask dishonest people. It was something much deeper and more personal. He was 75, had no children, and his brother had died 10 years earlier. His only relatives were his nephew and niece, both interested only in his inheritance. For years, William had sought someone to leave not just his money to, but his values, his worldview, his commitment to helping others. He had tested dozens of people, employees, collaborators, recipients of his donations, but all had failed. The safe test was the final examination to find his moral heir. He wasn't looking for someone who wouldn't steal his money. He was looking for someone who deserved to inherit the responsibility of doing good in the world. William continued explaining that in recent years he had created a charitable foundation that managed much of his wealth. The foundation helped needy families, funded medical research, supported young talents like Charlotte, but he needed someone trustworthy to run it when he was no longer there. All the money William had spent on anonymous donations over the years, including James's operation, had come from this foundation. Now he needed someone who shared his vision to continue this work. William stood up and went to the safe. He pulled out a thick file and placed it on the desk in front of Charlotte. It was his will, modified that very day after seeing Charlotte's behavior through the cameras. Charlotte was the new principal heir of Sir William Ashworth, not just of his money, but of the responsibility to manage the foundation that helped thousands of people. It was an enormous responsibility, but William was convinced Charlotte was the right person. William added that obviously he would also immediately solve her parents' shop problem, not as payment for passing the test, but as the first act of their collaboration. Charlotte would continue her studies, but would also begin learning how to manage the foundation. Charlotte finally found her voice to speak. She told William she was honored by his trust, but didn't feel equal to such great responsibility. She was just a country student who knew nothing about managing large sums of money. William smiled and told her that precisely that was why he had chosen her. People who thought they knew everything about money often forgot its true purpose. Charlotte, who had always had little, knew how important every pound was and how it could change people's lives. With trembling voice, Charlotte accepted, not for the money or power, but because she understood William was offering her the opportunity to make a difference in thousands of people's lives, just as he had done for James. William embraced her like a father embraces his daughter. For the first time in years, both felt they had found a family. 6 months later, Charlotte's life had changed completely, but not in the way many would have imagined. She didn't live in luxury, but had found her purpose in the world. Every morning she woke at 6 to study, then spent afternoons in the Ashworth Foundation offices, learning from William how to transform money into hope. Her parents' shop had been saved, and now thrived thanks to a foundation program supporting small businesses in struggling villages. Robert and Susan Bennett didn't know their salvation had come through their daughter because Charlotte had asked William to maintain anonymity even with them. Charlotte had completed her art history degree with first-class honors, but discovered her true passion was helping people. Under William's guidance, she had learned to evaluate charitable projects, manage donations, create support programs for needy families. The foundation had helped hundreds of families in those 6 months. Sick children who had received free treatment, young talents who had obtained scholarships, lonely elderly people who had found assistance. Charlotte realized every story was similar to hers. Honest people who found themselves in difficulties and just needed a chance. William, for his part, had rediscovered the joy of living. Seeing Charlotte grow in her new role had restored his enthusiasm for his projects. He no longer felt like a lonely and bitter man, but like a mentor, training his successor. The relationship between William and Charlotte had become that of a grandfather and granddaughter. They lunched together every day, discussing philosophy, art, and the meaning of life. Ashworth Manor had transformed from a silent mausoleum into a house full of life. One spring day, while reviewing the foundation's projects for the following year together, William said he had to make a confession. He explained that the safe test hadn't been the first time he had observed her. 3 months before hiring her, William had conducted thorough investigations about her. He had hired a private investigator to follow her for a week. The investigator had reported that Charlotte always shared food with poorer flatmates, helped an elderly lady in the building with shopping, had given her savings to a university friend to pay for a medical examination. William had understood even then that Charlotte was special. The safe test had been only the final confirmation of what he already knew. He had found the moral heir he had been seeking for years. Charlotte smiled, not angry about being spied upon, but touched that William had seen something good in her before even meeting her personally. William pulled out one last document from the safe. It was a project he had had in mind for years, but never realized. He wanted to create a network of young people like Charlotte throughout England, honest and determined people who could manage charitable foundations in their regions. The project was called Network of Hope and was to identify and train a new generation of philanthropists who shared William and Charlotte's values. Charlotte looked at the project with shining eyes. It was perfect. Instead of concentrating all power in one person, they would create a network of exceptional people who would bring hope to every corner of England. That evening, while dining with William on the terrace overlooking the Cotswolds countryside, Charlotte thought about the incredible journey that had taken her from a housekeeper guarding an open safe to a woman responsible for changing thousands of lives. William's test had revealed much more than either of them had imagined. It hadn't just discovered Charlotte's honesty, but had created a bond that would bring hope to people who didn't even know they needed it. William looked at Charlotte smiling as she contemplated the lights of Oxford in the distance. He was 75, but for the first time felt immortal. His most important legacy wasn't money or property, but the values he had passed on to an extraordinary girl who would carry them forward for generations. Charlotte raised her eyes and met William's gaze. Without saying a word, both knew they had found what they were looking for. A family built not on blood or interest, but on trust, respect, and sharing a common dream. The safe test was over, but their story together had just begun. If this story moved you and made you reflect on the value of honesty, give it a like and share. Charlotte and William prove there are still people you can trust in this world. Subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. Activate the bell. Remember, honesty isn't just a virtue, it's an investment in the future. Those who do what's right when no one is watching are people upon whom we can build a better world.